In the early hours of September 22nd, as most of Denmark still slept, the first alerts began to appear. Not in the newspapers, not in government briefings, but in the frantic messages of travelers stranded at Copenhagen airport. Flights, suddenly and without warning, had been cancelled. Terminals filled with confusion. Airport staff repeated the same phrase, technical difficulties. But the truth was something far stranger. Above the capital, in the very skies where the clearest images of the unidentified objects had been taken just days earlier, the phenomenon had returned. This time, not a single glowing orb, nor a solitary triangular craft hanging in the night, but dozens, a swarm. Witnesses spoke of flickering green lights dancing in formation, others of silent, perfectly spherical orbs hovering just beyond the clouds. Some claimed the objects pulsed in unison, as if communicating, while others swore they shifted their formations with military precision. Whatever they were, their presence sent ripple effects through one of Europe's busiest air corridors. The authorities had a choice to make: risk civilian flights crossing paths with something they could not identify, or shut everything down. For the first time in living memory, Copenhagen airport closed its skies because of UFOs. Within hours, Oslo followed. Flights were grounded, delays stretched for miles of waiting passengers, and whispers began to spread across Europe. Some believed it was terrorism, others about it, but the official explanations were vague, contradictory, and curiously muted. The word UFO never appeared in any statement, yet it hovered in the air, heavier than the crafts themselves. By dawn, chaos had spread to social media. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag Copenhagen shutdown. Hashtag Oslo airspace. Hashtag UFOs over Europe. Eyewitness footage flooded TikTok and X-screen orbs hovering over terminals. Bright flashes across the night sky, and in one now viral clip, a cluster of lights seemingly merging into a single, massive triangular silhouette that dwarfed the skyline. Skeptics dismissed it as lens flare or coordinated drone swarms, but the sheer number of recordings, from so many different vantage points, made denial difficult. This was not one person with a shaky camera in the dark. This was hundreds, maybe thousands, of people all seeing the same impossible shapes. As the hours passed, pressure mounted. News outlets scrambled to cover the story while also tiptoeing around official silence. Anchors on Danish television spoke in carefully chosen language: unidentified aerial phenomena, temporary airspace anomalies, unusual sky activity. Never once did the word alien cross their lips, but the public was already connecting the dots. For travelers trapped inside grounded airports, frustration turned to fear. Rumors spread of military jets scrambled over the North Sea, of radar operators unable to track the objects, of flight controllers watching helplessly as unidentified returns appeared and vanished from their screens. No official confirmation, but the whispers grew louder with each retelling. By midday, the story had spread across Europe. London tabloids splashed dramatic headlines: UFOs swarm grounds flights in Berlin. Officials hinted at infrastructure disruptions in Paris. Speculation turned geopolitical: were these Russian drones probing European defenses, or was China behind a new surveillance campaign? Yet even the most hardened analysts admitted uneasily, the objects did not move like drones. Unlike drones, there was no sound. Unlike drones, their endurance was impossible. And unlike drones, they seemed to appear and vanish without explanation, defying both radar and reason. In the absence of facts, theories multiplied. Some pointed to natural plasma phenomena, like ball lightning, magnified by unusual atmospheric conditions. Others insisted it was mass hysteria fueled by viral videos. But then came the testimonies that could not be ignored. Pilots grounded at Copenhagen spoke quietly of shapes larger than any drone, gliding silently across restricted airspace. Airport staff described an internal scramble. Security pushed back journalists. Military officials arrived in plain clothes, and access to control towers was suddenly restricted. For ordinary passengers, it was an inconvenience. For insiders, it was something closer to a cover-up. One anonymous employee, speaking through a whistleblower channel, described what they called cover drones. Small conventional drones deployed to distract the public and provide a plausible explanation. "We were told to keep people calm," the employee wrote, "but what we saw on the radar wasn't ours. Nothing human flies like that." Still, the public narrative remained controlled. News anchors repeated phrases like temporary security measures and unidentified air interference. Authorities assured travelers it was safe, though flights remained grounded for hours. Behind the scenes, something larger was unfolding, but outside, families sat on their luggage. Children cried in departure halls, and the skies above northern Europe remained closed. What was so threatening that entire nations halted their air traffic? What kind of presence could force modern governments to bring their most critical infrastructure to a standstill? The answer, for now, remained unspoken, but the message was clear. Whatever was above Denmark and Norway that night, it was powerful enough to silence airports, overwhelm governments, and leave millions of people staring nervously at the skies, waiting for an explanation that never came. And so part 2 begins not with a single photograph, not with one man's testimony, but with the undeniable fact that for a single day in September, the skies over northern Europe did not belong to us. The shutdown of Copenhagen and Oslo should have been the climax of the story. Airports rarely close. When they do, it makes headlines across the world. Yet in this case, what should have been a clear emergency protocol only deepened the mystery. Because as soon as the airports fell silent, the skies above them grew louder with speculation. On social media, panic took shape in real time. Videos captured from rooftops and highways spread like wildfire. Each one showed something slightly different: green lights darting across the horizon, clusters of glowing spheres floating over city centers, or in one particularly chilling clip, an object so large and silent it blocked out the stars behind it. What unnerved people most wasn't the strangeness of the images, but their clarity. Gone were the days of blurry photographs or shaky camcorder footage dismissed as hoaxes. These were sharp, vivid, unmistakable. Ordinary people, using ordinary phones, were capturing extraordinary events, and it left skeptics scrambling for explanations. Some dismissed the lights as drones. "It's a light show," one aviation blogger declared. Coordinated drone swarms. We've seen this before at festivals and sports events, but almost immediately, counterarguments appeared. Drone shows require planning, synchronization, and power. Yet these objects appeared unannounced, without warning, and with an endurance far beyond known technology. Others pointed to satellites, reflections, or even atmospheric phenomena. But then came the eyewitness testimonies that refused to fit neatly into those categories. A family driving on the Resund Bridge swore they saw orbs hovering motionless above the water, only to dart away at impossible speeds. A fisherman near Helsinki described a glowing triangle silently gliding overhead, so low he thought it might touch the masts of his boat. Contradictions piled up. Some described metallic crafts with defined edges, while others saw nothing but luminous spheres. Some reported absolute silence, others a faint hum or low vibration. The more accounts that surfaced, the less consistent the story became. Yet one detail kept returning: the color green. Glowing, pulsing, shifting shades of emerald light that seemed to radiate from beneath the objects. Theories rushed in to fill the vacuum. Were these experimental aircraft from Europe's own militaries, NATO prototypes being quietly tested, or were they intrusion spy drones from Russia, probing defenses at a time of heightened global tension? Both explanations seemed possible, yet both carried enormous implications. And then there were those who refused to frame the sightings within earthly possibilities. For them, the scale of the phenomenon, combined with the timing, was too coincidental. "These aren't tests," one commentator wrote. "These are visitations." As debates raged online, official channels remained eerily silent. Danish authorities refused to confirm or deny the presence of unidentified craft. Norway's aviation agency cited airspace interference. Even Sweden, usually quick to comment on Baltic security, said nothing at all. The silence was deafening and in many ways, more alarming than an admission. Meanwhile, passengers trapped inside grounded airports grew restless. Some tried to live-stream the skies from terminal windows, only for security to intervene. Others were told to stop filming altogether. Stories began circulating of men in plain clothes, speaking into radios, moving swiftly through the terminals. Who they were, nobody knew, but their presence suggested that what was happening outside wasn't simply a technical glitch. Inside air traffic control rooms, the situation was more tense. Whistleblowers later described radar screens lighting up with returns that did not behave like conventional aircraft. Some blips hovered, others appeared, disappeared, then reappeared in places no plane could have reached in such short time. The term radar ghosts was muttered, but even seasoned operators admitted privately they had never seen anything like it. And yet, no official explanation reached the public. Instead, statements remained bland, evasive, and deliberately unsatisfying, which only fueled suspicion that the truth was being hidden. Across Europe, television panels filled with experts, aviation engineers, military analysts, UFO researchers, all arguing furiously. Some insisted the phenomenon was man-made, a test gone wrong, or a probe from hostile powers. Others declared it unprecedented, pointing out the simultaneous shutdown of multiple airports was no small coincidence. For the first time in modern history, mainstream voices seriously entertained the possibility that something unearthly was at play. But it was not just the scale of the sightings that made this wave different. It was the human reaction. Fear spread faster than the lights themselves. Parents clutched their children in terminals. Commuters refused to board trains beneath the glowing skies, and across Denmark, Norway, and even Sweden, people reported sleepless nights staring upward, waiting for something else to appear. It was as if the very fabric of normal life air travel, work routines, the unquestioned safety of the skies had been shaken loose. If airports could be shut down at a moment's notice by forces unnamed and unexplained, what did that say about humanity's control of its own world? The silence from above was matched only by the silence from those in power. And silence, as it always does, only deepened the suspicion.
Silence is rarely innocent. In the hours after the shutdowns, silence became its own kind of language, one louder and more unnerving than any official statement could have been. Copenhagen Airport released a brief message: operations suspended due to airspace safety concerns. Oslo echoed the same line. No details, no elaboration, no timeline, but just the same copy and paste phrase that looked less like information and more like a carefully chosen placeholder. For the public, this blandness felt insulting. People had seen the skies themselves. They had captured footage. They had heard the rumors spreading like wildfire across terminals and social feeds. Yet officials seemed determined to pretend nothing unusual had happened. And the more they ignored it, the more suspicion grew that something monumental was unfolding behind closed doors. Inside government corridors, however, there was no silence, only chaos. Leaked reports suggested NATO had convened an emergency call within hours of the incidents. Denmark and Norway, both members of the alliance, raised urgent concerns about unidentified objects penetrating airspace over civilian hubs. To let such phenomena go unchallenged would have been unthinkable. Yet the problem was clear. These weren't intrusions by any recognizable adversary. Tremere tracks didn't match Russian aircraft. The objects did not originate from Kaliningrad, Murmansk, or other known bases. They didn't even behave like drones. They stopped, accelerated, vanished. In some cases, they ignored standard physical constraints altogether, and that posed a dilemma no military was prepared for. For NATO, the language of defense depends on certainty, hostiles, threats, strategic responses. But what do you do when the objects in your skies do not register as weapons, yet they defy the very categories your defense depends on? Meanwhile, in Danish and Norwegian intelligence circles, arguments raged. Some claimed the objects were an elaborate show of force by Russia or China, designed to expose weaknesses in European air defense. Others whispered about black-budget American projects, prototypes so advanced that even allies were kept in the dark. But the most unsettling suggestion of all was the one nobody wanted to put on paper: that the origin was non-human. If that possibility was even considered in closed briefings, it never leaked directly. But what did leak were fragments, descriptions of frantic phone calls. Radar technicians asked to delete logs. Civilian pilots told to classify encounters as unverified atmospheric disturbances. To those who studied government cover-ups, the pattern looked painfully familiar. Northern Europe had been here before. In the 1980s, Finland and Sweden had faced waves of mysterious incursions over the Baltic Sea. Locals called them the ghost rockets. Strange, luminous objects darted across military radar, sometimes crashing into lakes, sometimes vanishing mid-flight. Investigations were launched. Nothing conclusive was ever admitted. Files were sealed. The incidents faded into obscurity, at least officially. But to UFO researchers, the ghost rockets had never gone away. They were unfinished business, an unanswered chapter of Europe's UFO history. And now, decades later, the skies seemed to be rewriting that story on a larger scale. This time, though, the stakes were higher. Airports had been shut down, civilian life disrupted, livelihoods interrupted. The mystery had crossed a line from fringe fascination into national security, economic disruption, and public panic. Whistleblowers within NATO reportedly began using a phrase that sent chills down the spine: strategic ambiguity. It meant admitting privately that the phenomenon was real while refusing to define it publicly. To call it foreign would risk escalating tensions with Russia or China. To call it extraterrestrial would risk mass panic and destroy credibility. And so the safest option was to say nothing. But silence is never empty. It is a vacuum, and vacuums attract speculation. As silence dragged on, civilians filled the void. Videos went viral. Hashtags trended across Europe. Hashtag Denmark lights. Hashtag UFOs over Oslo. Hashtag airports shut down. Talk show hosts brought in self-proclaimed experts, skeptics, and conspiracy theorists, all arguing over the same grainy clips. The official silence became its own evidence, a refusal to answer, interpreted as confirmation. And yet, beneath the noise of speculation, one haunting question persisted. Why Denmark? Why Norway? Why now? The Nordic skies had seen strange phenomena before the Northern Lights. Ghostly green curtains of charged particles dancing across the heavens. But these new lights were something else entirely. They didn't drift. They maneuvered. They pulsed in patterns. And in one chilling video, filmed by a student outside Copenhagen, the lights seemed to arrange themselves into a formation 3 points in a perfect triangle, hovering motionless over the city before dispersing. It wasn't just random chaos. It was behavior, deliberate, structured, intelligent. That was when whispers began of a deeper connection. Some claimed these events were tied to earlier sightings across Europe, flashes reported in France, spheres over Germany, anomalies tracked by amateur astronomers in the North Sea, each one dismissed in isolation. But now, seen together, they painted a troubling pattern. Something was moving across the continent, probing, observing, interrupting. And the silence of those in power suggested they knew more than they were willing to admit. In the end, it wasn't the lights in the sky that terrified people most. It was the growing realization that the authorities weren't in control, that the airports could be shut, the planes grounded, and the skies filled with objects that no government dared name. But for the first time in living memory, Europe felt small, its airspace no longer its own, its sovereignty stripped away not by an invading army, but by something far more elusive. And as rumors of new NATO meetings swirled, one question hung in the air like a shadow over every conversation. What if this wasn't an isolated incident, but the beginning of something much larger?
The skies were no longer silent. Within 72 hours of the Copenhagen and Oslo shutdowns, reports began surfacing across Europe, first in scattered whispers, then in a steady drumbeat of sightings too widespread to ignore. From northern Germany to the Netherlands, from Poland to the British Isles, the same descriptions echoed again and again: glowing orbs, hovering triangles, green lights pulsing in the night. It was no longer a local incident, it was spreading. By Tuesday evening, air traffic controllers in Hamburg reported multiple radar anomalies over the North Sea. Pilots descending into Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam described unidentified illuminated formations at cruising altitude, formations that shifted positions too smoothly to be turbulence, too intelligently to be dismissed as flares. Civilian witnesses were equally unnerved. In small towns across Belgium, families looked up to see triangular shadows blotting out the stars. Fishermen off the coast of Norway claimed their sonar registered vast moving shapes beneath the surface, as though whatever haunted the skies had a counterpart in the waters below. And yet, as the reports multiplied, so did the silences. Authorities stuck to vague phrases, airspace anomalies, precautionary measures, routine investigations. But leaked chatter told another story. According to one anonymous source within the European Space Operations Center, ESOC, at least one of the objects had been tracked from orbit. Satellite sensors recorded a luminous body entering Europe's atmosphere at extraordinary speed before slowing abruptly, something no known craft could achieve without catastrophic heat signatures. The object's trajectory suggested it had crossed the Arctic Circle and entered northern skies with surgical precision. For those who believed, this was confirmation. For skeptics, it was fuel for deeper questions. How had this information leaked so quickly? Why did satellite agencies remain silent while social media burned with speculation? Was the leak itself deliberate, a signal to insiders that the truth could no longer be contained? Meanwhile, ordinary citizens lived the consequences. Flights continued to be disrupted, business trips cancelled, cargo shipments delayed, families stranded in terminals from Berlin to Brussels. Every time an unidentified craft appeared, the domino effect rippled across an already fragile aviation network. For travelers, it no longer mattered whether the objects were drones, prototypes, or something alien. The reality was the same. Europe's skies could be shut down at any moment, and fear has a way of amplifying itself. In Warsaw, hundreds gathered outside the Parliament building demanding answers, waving homemade signs that read, "Who owns the skies?" In London, tabloids screamed headlines about alien invasions, while morning talk shows hosted both UFO researchers and military analysts who offered no clear answers. In Paris, one broadcast showed families scanning the night sky with binoculars, children pointing at faint glimmers that may have been stars or something more. By midweek, the paranoia was undeniable. Calls flooded emergency hotlines across Europe. Every shooting star, every satellite pass, every glint of light became suspect. The sheer volume of reports overwhelmed both civilian and military tracking systems, blurring the line between truth and hysteria. But behind the scenes, the signals were more disturbing. Leaked military intercepts suggested that unidentified objects were flying in patterns, not random appearances, but coordinated paths across Europe. In one case, radar operators in Denmark, Germany, and the UK all reported the same formation. 3 luminous objects moving in a triangle, perfectly synchronized, maintaining identical speed and altitude across hundreds of kilometers. That level of coordination unnerved even hardened skeptics. If these were drones, they were unlike any drones on Earth. If they were aircraft, they obeyed no known limitations of fuel, endurance, or range. And if they were something else entirely, the implications were staggering. For governments, the greatest fear was no longer public panic, it was loss of control, loss of narrative, loss of sovereignty itself. In Brussels, whispers emerged of a closed-door EU security meeting. Ministers debated whether to issue a joint statement acknowledging the phenomenon. Some argued for transparency. The public already knew too much, and silence was eroding trust. Others urged secrecy. Acknowledgement without answers would only inflame paranoia. In the end, no statement came. Europe's leaders chose silence again, but silence no longer worked. That night, videos surfaced from Ireland, grainy but unmistakable. 3 orbs glowing above the Atlantic, hovering over Shannon Airport. Minutes later, a second video from Spain showed nearly identical lights near Madrid. The images raced across social platforms, sparking theories that the phenomenon was moving southward, expanding in scale, in reach, in intent. The narrative had shifted. What began as isolated airport closures in Denmark and Norway was now understood as something far larger, a coordinated wave of incursions sweeping across Europe. Whether by human hands or something beyond, the skies were no longer secure. And deep inside the corridors of NATO, one phrase began to circulate in whispers, chilling those who heard it. This is not an incident. This is a campaign.
Global media frenzy. By the 5th day of the renewed swarm, the Denmark incident had gone far beyond regional headlines. CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera ran back-to-back coverage. News tickers across Asia, South America, and Africa lit up with urgent banners. UFO swarm grounds flights in Denmark. Hashtags like hashtag Denmark UFOs, hashtag airports shut down, and hashtag alien swarm dominated global trending lists. Major news outlets replayed the same footage over and over, glowing metallic spheres hovering over airport terminals, flickering in and out of visibility like mirages. But what caught the most attention were the hundreds of amateur recordings streaming in from citizens. From smartphones to dashcams, from shaky live streams to higher resolution drones. Every angle revealed one chilling consistency. These objects behaved with purpose. The swarm no longer seemed random. It looked choreographed, and the world was beginning to ask who or what was controlling them. New eyewitness footage emerges. On the outskirts of Aalborg, a farmer captured what might be the clearest footage yet. His video, later broadcast on international TV, shows a cluster of 6 metallic orbs descending silently into a field before rising back up in a flash of blinding white light. What makes this clip extraordinary isn't just the clarity of the objects, but what they left behind. Investigators who visited the field found a perfectly circular burn mark, nearly 30 meters wide, etched into the soil. The grass within the circle was blackened and brittle, while the soil itself registered abnormal radiation readings. Even more disturbing, several eyewitnesses reported that farm equipment nearby malfunctioned instantly when the orbs descended, engines stalled, cell phones powered off, and a tractor's onboard computer went completely dead. The strange electromagnetic effects across Denmark, similar reports surfaced. Residents complained of Wi-Fi outages, radios filled with static, and unexplained surges that fried household appliances. At Copenhagen Airport, pilots described their cockpits going dark for seconds at a time, their instruments spinning wildly before stabilizing again. A leaked audio recording between 2 air traffic controllers has already gone viral. Controller 1, radar's gone blank again. Are you seeing this? Controller 2, they're right above the runway. Nothing else explains this. Keep the jets grounded. Do not scramble. Scientists suspect the swarm may be emitting an intense electromagnetic field, strong enough to disrupt communications, power grids, and even medical devices. In one shocking case, a man in Odense claimed his pacemaker briefly stopped during the swarm. Passage overhead, though doctors remain cautious about drawing direct conclusions. NATO scrambles into action behind closed doors. NATO leaders convened an emergency summit. Sources inside Brussels suggest that Denmark invoked Article 4 of the NATO treaty, a rarely used clause reserved for moments when a member state feels its territorial integrity is under direct threat. Reports leaked to international media suggest that fighter jets from Germany and the UK were placed on high alert, with American F-35s temporarily relocated to Ramstein Air Base. Satellite imagery analysis from the US space. Force is said to be ongoing, but officials refuse to disclose what their sensors have picked up. One defense insider told Reuters that they're treating this as a national security event. If these things move beyond Denmark, we may be looking at the first coordinated multinational military response to UFOs in history. The world holds its breath. As night fell over Europe, live streams of the Danish skies drew millions of viewers worldwide. The swarm glowed faintly above Copenhagen, shifting slowly like a silent storm. Families huddled indoors, airports remained deserted, and the silence of officials only deepened the dread. The question was no longer if these entities were real, but what they wanted, and whether NATO would risk an escalation that might trigger a conflict humanity is unprepared for. Closing hook set up for Part 6.6. The world is now holding its breath. Governments can no longer dismiss this as hysteria. NATO is preparing a response. And as the swarm grows bolder, humanity faces a terrifying choice: confrontation or surrender. In the final Part 6/6, we'll explore the breaking climax, what happens when NATO makes its move, and whether these UFOs are here to warn us, or to start something we cannot control.
The NATO response began quietly, almost unnoticeably. Satellite trackers reported unusual movement over northern Europe, fleets of military aircraft taking off in synchronized patterns. NATO forces had shifted from surveillance to active engagement readiness. From Ramstein Air Base in Germany, a squadron of F-35 stealth fighters lifted into the skies. RAF Typhoons scrambled from the UK. Even reports from Poland suggested Patriot missile batteries had been repositioned, their radar arrays sweeping the northern skies with heightened frequency. The Danish Prime Minister, in a late-night televised address, tried to remain calm but could not hide the tension in her voice. This is not a drill. We are in constant contact with our NATO allies. Every measure is being taken to ensure the safety of our citizens. I asked the public to stay indoors and remain vigilant. The words were measured, but the silence between each sentence felt heavier than any alarm. Mass global attention across the world, people gathered in front of screens. New York's Times Square broadcast live aerial feeds of the Danish swarm. In Tokyo, citizens huddled around train station monitors, whispering as glowing orbs filled the sky thousands of miles away. Social media was ablaze. Some called it the dawn of disclosure. Others claimed it was a carefully orchestrated cover for a new Cold War-era weapon. But most millions of terrified voices online echoed the same phrase over and over again: this is not normal. The videos flooding in from Europe only deepened the fear. Amateur drone footage captured formations of orbs hovering with mathematical precision. In some frames they appeared to shift into triangular patterns eerily resembling the earlier viral photographs. One chilling clip from Copenhagen showed a swarm passing directly over a NATO fighter jet. Instead of scattering, the orbs surrounded it, maintaining a perfect sphere formation, as if examining the aircraft before dispersing. The pilot's radio log later leaked. "Pilot, they're not fleeing. They're holding me in a box. They know I'm here. Command, break off. Break off immediately." The electromagnetic chaos peaks by now. The electromagnetic disturbances were no longer isolated. Entire neighborhoods across Denmark reported power outages. Hospitals switched to backup generators. Car engines failed en masse on highways. In one alarming case, a Danish military convoy transporting radar equipment reportedly stalled at the exact moment a cluster of green orbs hovered above them. Every vehicle, trucks, jeeps, even tanks, went dark. For 7 minutes, soldiers stood helpless in the eerie glow of the objects, unable to radio for help. Then, as suddenly as they had arrived, the orbs vanished into the clouds and the engines roared back to life. Engineers and scientists scrambled for answers, but the pattern was undeniable. These objects were deliberately disabling technology, almost as if demonstrating control over humanity's most vital systems. The world on edge in Brussels. NATO officials debated their options. A strike could escalate into catastrophic consequences, but inaction, with airports shut down and European infrastructure faltering, risked mass chaos. Meanwhile, Moscow and Beijing released cryptic statements condemning Western mismanagement of unidentified aerial phenomena. Russian state media went further, suggesting NATO's moves might trigger a global conflict under the pretext of UFOs. The tension was unbearable. Humanity stood at the brink of something no one had prepared for. The moment of contact. Then came the footage that shocked the world. A Danish fisherman, recording from his boat near the Resund Bridge, captured what appeared to be a mass descent of nearly 50 glowing objects into the water. They hovered for minutes, their reflections shimmering across the waves, before plunging beneath the surface. A local naval vessel immediately reported unexplained sonar contacts moving at impossible speeds underwater. It was the first time the swarm had revealed a possible destination, not just the skies, but the oceans. The symbolism, a new era. The symbolism was undeniable. Humanity's airspace, once a domain of dominance, was now shared. The skies, once ours, belonged to something else. And now, even the oceans, the last frontier of mystery, seemed claimed. For centuries, civilizations had looked up and wondered. For decades, governments had dismissed and denied. But in a single week, over Denmark, the truth had shattered through. This was no longer a question of if we were being watched. It was a question of why. And so, as NATO holds its line, as the orbs drift between our runways, over our capitals, into our oceans, humanity waits. Is this the first step of contact? A silent show of force? Or a warning that our age of dominance has ended? Because tonight, as green lights shimmer over Denmark, the world has changed forever. And the final question lingers in the silence of the skies. What hovers above Northern Europe tonight may not just be in their skies, but in ours as well.